Hello everyone, today I'm doing another video on the Septuagint and the Book of Esther. I said in my first video that I might turn it into a series, and that's what I decided to do, so I plan to do even more videos on the Septuagint in the future. Now in this video, I'm talking about why the Septuagint is better than the Masoretic Text in general, and then I'll also provide more evidence for the longer version of Esther in particular. So a major thing you should know about the Septuagint is that it is often already used to some extent in our Bible translations, although not as much as it should be. There are various prophecies of Christ that are only found in the Septuagint, many of which are quoted in the New Testament, because the Jews who rejected Christ intentionally removed them from their Hebrew manuscripts that the Masoretic text was later based on, and most Bible translations go with the Septuagint already in several of these cases. Here are a few examples. Matthew 1:22-23 says, "All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel," which means God with us. Matthew is quoting Isaiah 7:14b, which says in the ESV, "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." The ESV is following the Septuagint here because the Masoretic text says young woman instead of virgin. The unbelieving Jews changed it in their manuscripts to remove the prophecy of the virgin birth of Jesus. Then Luke 4:17-21 says, "And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll and gave it back to the attendant and sat down. And the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him, and he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." Jesus is quoting Isaiah 61:1-2a, but in the ESV those verses say, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." The ESV sides with the Masoretic text here when it shouldn't, because an important part of the passage Jesus reads is recovering of sight to the blind. Jesus on multiple occasions miraculously healed blindness in fulfillment of this prophecy, but this line is only present in the Septuagint. It's missing from the Masoretic text and the ESV because the unbelieving Jews removed it from their manuscripts to try to discredit Jesus. Now another example is Psalm 22:16. The ESV says, "For dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet." This is clearly a prophecy of the Christ's crucifixion, and Jesus even quotes the beginning of Psalm 22 on the cross in order to bring this to mind. But the ESV is following the Septuagint here, because the Masoretic text says, "Like a lion they are at my hands and feet." The unbelieving Jews removed the word pierced and changed the text so that it was no longer a clear prophecy of the crucifixion of Jesus. And I could go on. There are countless more examples like this. The Jews after the time of Christ systematically changed their scriptures in order to remove Jesus from them as much as possible. The early church fathers even attest to this occurring. Justin Martyr, writing in approximately AD 150, says in chapter 71 of his dialogue with Trypho the Jew, "But I am far from putting reliance in your teachers, who refuse to admit that the interpretation made by the 70 elders who were with Ptolemy of the Egyptians is a correct one," that is, the Septuagint, "and they attempt to frame another. And I wish you to observe that they have altogether taken away many scriptures from the translations effected by those 70 elders who were with Ptolemy, and by which this very man who is crucified is proved to have been set forth expressly as God and man, and as being crucified, and as dying. This is why the early fathers all preferred to use the Septuagint rather than the Hebrew manuscripts that existed at their time." Now with that being said, in my video on Esther, I defended the Septuagint version of the Book of Esther, which is significantly longer than the Masoretic version, and now I have additional evidence that will bolster the arguments I already made in that video. But first, something I didn't explain in my video on the additions to Esther that may have been confusing is how the chapter and verse numbers work in the additions, since they are supposed to be spread throughout the book, and yet constitute chapters 10b through 16. The reason why the versification is out of order in the longer version is because the chapter and verse numbers were added to the Latin Vulgate made by Jerome, who took the sections that aren't in the Hebrew and moved them all to the end. So it starts with section F being Esther 10:4-11:1, and then after that section A is 11:2-12:6, B is 13:1-7, C is 13:8-14:19, D is 15:1-16, and E is 16:1-24. Now, as I've said before, I believe the Jews removed these sections, just like how they removed many Messianic prophecies that clearly point to Jesus. So let's get into some more evidence for that. I argued in my last video that the absence of God in the Masoretic version could be explained by secular nationalistic Jews wanting to take the book and turn it into something that would fit their agenda, or by Jews wanting to be able to preserve the book in a time of persecution more easily. I said the latter was less likely, and I still think that's true, since if the book is completely changed, then that would hardly count as preservation. But there actually is reason to believe that this is a possibility, though, because the letters of Ignatius were treated in the same way by some Christians. Ignatius was one of the apostolic fathers, and he knew the Apostle John personally and wrote in the early 2nd century AD, probably in the year 107. He wrote 7 letters to different churches while on his way to be martyred. These letters have been preserved in 3 different versions. There is the middle recension, which is the authentic version, the long recension, which is an expansion of the originals, and the short recension, an abbreviated version of some of the originals that takes the theology out. The short recension was created because everyone already knew the doctrine and they just wanted to have the story of Ignatius. So the Jews could have similarly written an epitome of Esther in order to preserve the general traditional story, but with fewer details to make it easier to pass down and with the theology removed. Furthermore, one of the things that Protestant scholars and apologists such as Michael J. Kruger say is one of the criteria for canonicity is God being involved in the book. Kruger actually says that the divine quality of a book is the most important criteria. But the Hebrew version of Esther has no such divine quality. It has a secular tone. You could read it and give credit to any pagan god of the ancient world for bringing about the events of the book. There is fasting mentioned in the Hebrew, but Jews weren't the only people who fasted. Pagans did too. Now you could point out that the book is about the Jews who serve the true God, but the book was written at a time when they were being paganized. They were taken to Babylon and became acquainted with foreign gods, and even before the captivity they were worshipping idols everywhere, which is the whole reason why God sent them into exile in the first place. So in this context, would God then really inspire an author to write a book about how he saved the Jews from destruction during this time and not put his name or his law in it anywhere? But there's no question when you read the Greek version that the one behind it all is clearly the God of Scripture, the God of Ezra and Nehemiah, and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The prayers allude back to God's promises to them. The book has a theological continuity with the rest of the Old Testament, and the prayers in section C are actually very similar to what we see in Ezra and Nehemiah, which makes sense because Esther and Nehemiah were contemporaries. Esther is actually referenced in Nehemiah 2:6. But the Hebrew version completely lacks all this. Kruger's criteria of canonicity fails to defend the Hebrew version of Esther. And it does make sense to ask whether a book can really be canonical without any mention of God. You don't have to look very hard in Daniel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, which were written around the same time, to find God in them. If Esther is God-breathed, would God really not have included himself in the text? The Septuagint version is focused on God and his ability to rescue his people, and a major emphasis missing from the Hebrew version is that what God does in the book is an answer to prayer and a fulfillment of prophecy. If you just read the Hebrew version, you could argue it's actually just Mordecai and Esther's own wisdom that gave them the ability to rescue the people themselves, perhaps without even being faithful Jews. But in the Greek version, Esther has to ask God for wisdom and boldness she knows she doesn't have, and God answers her prayer and uses her to save his people. Now, in the Protestant Reformation, the Hebrew version was unfortunately preferred, and actually this led to neglect of the Book of Esther. Martin Luther was highly critical of it, and John Calvin showed little engagement with it at all. Luther actually expressed strong dislike for Esther, especially in his later years. He called it less worthy of being held canonical than other books of the Old Testament, and said that Esther Judaizes too much and contains much heathen naughtiness. He even said, "The book of Esther I toss into the river, and I am such an enemy to the book of Esther that I wish it did not exist." He thought it overemphasized the Jews' victory in a way that he saw as vengeful and containing pagan elements. Calvin, though, simply showed far less interest in the book. He only ever cited it one time, and he evidently did not preach on it or really engage with it at all. But if they would have used the longer version, this would have not been the case. It's a bit difficult to fault Luther for thinking the way he did given only the Hebrew, which lacks any reference to God. Calvin's disinterest is also understandable, but the Greek text does not have this issue. It's the version the early church preferred, so we should prefer it as well. And another thing that is better about the Greek version that I neglected to mention in my first video is the difference regarding the number of people killed in the battle in chapter 9. In Esther 9:16, the ESV based on the Hebrew says, "The Jews killed 75,000 of those who hated them." But Esther 9:16 in the Nets, based on the Greek, says, "For they killed 15,000 of them." Now, ancient scribes were commonly known to expand and exaggerate large numbers, making them larger, not smaller. And especially in this case, if it's true that the Hebrew form of Esther was created by a secular, nationalistic, Gentile-hating Jew who removed and changed portions of the book, it seems clear to me that 15,000 is the original reading, being a much more reasonable and believable number than 75,000 anyway. A Jewish scribe who hated the Gentiles and was already changing the book in other ways would surely be inclined to increase a smaller number, especially given that scribes did this sort of thing all the time. But why would an ancient Jewish scribe make the larger number smaller? It makes way more sense that the reading of 15,000 later gave rise to the reading of 75,000, and not the other way around. Next, I mentioned briefly in the previous video that Josephus used the longer version, and I want to go more in depth on this. Josephus was a Roman Jewish historian, military leader, priest, and scholar from an aristocratic family in Jerusalem. He came from a priestly lineage, with his mother claiming Hasmonean royal descent. He received a strong education in Jewish law and traditions, aligning himself with the Pharisees. One of his major works was the Antiquities of the Jews, which is a comprehensive 20-volume history of the Jewish people from creation to his time, in which he relies heavily on the Old Testament and other historical works for events before the 1st century. He is one of the most important non-biblical sources for 1st century Judaism, the Second Temple period, and the historical context of early Christianity. Besides the Bible, his works are the best source for the history and antiquity of ancient Israel, and he is viewed by scholars as being generally reliable. The early Christians thought so too, preserving and studying his work. And in writing his history of the Jews, Josephus clearly uses the longer version of Esther and believes it is a reliable history in Antiquities, Book 11, Chapter 6, where he uses Edition C. Accordingly, Mordecai did as Esther had directed him and made the people fast, and he begged God together with them not to overlook his nation, particularly at this time when it was going to be destroyed. but that as he had often before provided for them and forgiven when they had sinned, so he would now deliver them from that destruction which was pronounced against them. For although it was not all the nation that had offended, yet must they so ingloriously be killed, and that he was himself the occasion of the wrath of Haman. Because, said he, I did not worship him, nor could I endure to pay that honor to him which I used to pay to you, O Lord. For upon that his anger has he contrived this present mischief against those that have not transgressed your laws. The same supplications did the multitude put up, and entreated that God would provide for their deliverance, and free the Israelites that were in all the earth from this calamity which was now coming upon them, for they had it before their eyes, and expected its coming. Accordingly, Esther made supplication to God after the manner of her country by casting herself down upon the earth, and putting on her mourning garments, and bidding farewell to meat and drink and all delicacies for 3 days' time. And she entreated God to have mercy upon her, and make her words appear persuasive to the king, and render her countenance more beautiful than it was before, that both by her words and beauty she might succeed, for the averting of the king's anger, in case he were at all irritated against her, and for the consolation of those of her own country. Now they were in the utmost danger of perishing, as also that he would excite a hatred in the king against the enemies of the Jews, and those that had contrived their future destruction, if they proved to be scorned by him. So Josephus follows the Greek version here by including these details that emphasize prayer and God's role, and there are also other indications of reliance on the longer version in his overall narrative style and other details. Josephus' version aligns more closely with Greek Esther than the Hebrew in phrasing, dramatic elements, and religious tone. His handling of Esther approaching the king has similarities to the Greek, and there are also traces of Edition A. He adds interpretive expansions that are more consistent with what the Greek version says than the Hebrew as well. So a knowledgeable and reliable first-century Jewish historian preferred the longer version of Esther and saw it as accurate, which is really good evidence for its canonicity in the Old Testament. But we have even better evidence from Clement of Rome. This is what I found that made me think a second video on this was absolutely necessary. Clement of Rome was a mid-1st century bishop in Rome and one of the earliest apostolic fathers whose writings survive. He was born in Rome in the AD 30s and died via martyrdom around the end of the 1st century during the reign of Emperor Trajan. Importantly, he knew the apostles personally and worked closely with them. He was taught by them directly. Paul mentions him by name in Philippians 4:3, saying, "Help these women who have labored side by side with me in the gospel, together with Clement and the rest of my fellow workers, whose names are in the book of life." Furthermore, we know that it was Peter himself who ordained him. Now, Clement is primarily known for the book of 1 Clement, a letter written from the church in Rome to the church in Corinth early in the year AD 70, just a few months before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. It addresses a schism in Corinth, urging humility, order, unity, and respect for church leadership. The letter draws heavily on the Old Testament and the teachings of Jesus and Paul, and it was highly regarded in the early church. The reason it's called 1 Clement is because there is also a book called 2 Clement, but 2 Clement is probably pseudepigraphal and not actually written by Clement, even though it's still from very early in church history. Now, Clement refers to the book of Esther in 1 Clement 55:6, and he clearly assumes the longer version is correct. He presents Esther as a positive example of self-sacrificial love and courage, saying Esther also, being perfect in faith, exposed herself to no less danger in order to deliver the 12 tribes of Israel from impending destruction. For with fasting and humiliation she entreated the everlasting God who sees all things, and he, perceiving the humility of her spirit, delivered the people for whose sake she had encountered peril. Clement says Esther was perfect in faith and alludes to her prayer, but these elements are only found in the longer version, not the shorter version. He treats the longer version as historically accurate and the so-called additions as genuinely part of the story of Esther. There is absolutely no question that he thought the longer version was authentic and canonical. To me, this proves beyond any shadow of a doubt that the apostles believed the additions to Esther are scripture. Clement was taught directly by both Peter and Paul. He worked alongside Paul. He was ordained by Peter. If there was a shorter version of Esther that was superior to the longer version, Peter and Paul obviously would have known this, and they surely would have made sure Clement knew it too, but they didn't. It is utterly inconceivable that he would get this wrong, and the whole rest of the early church agreed. So in conclusion, the unbelieving Jews made various changes to their manuscripts for various reasons, most often to remove Jesus from the Old Testament. The Septuagint preserves the original readings better than the Masoretic Text, and was the version preferred by the apostles and the early church. Christ is seen more clearly in the Septuagint, and we ought to use it much more than we do, including in the book of Esther. The so-called additions to Esther belong in the book, even according to those who knew the apostles well, and the Greek version is much richer and better overall than the more secular Hebrew that the reformers didn't like very much. Now, there are various other differences between the Septuagint and the Masoretic Text that I plan to do videos on in the future. Daniel, Jeremiah, Job, and Proverbs in particular are very, very different between the two versions, and the Septuagint is definitely superior in Jeremiah, so my third video will be about that. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. God bless.